Hey everybody, good morning. Welcome back to class. Hope you all had a great weekend and enjoyed the Super Bowl if you were watching it. We have about 2.5 minutes, so I'll be with you guys in just a few. Thanks though for your attendance wherever you are and whenever you're watching this. Hi guys, good morning. Just another minute and a half, pretty much. Hey Sebastian, hey McKenna, good to see you guys. Hey Sydney, good to see you too. Hello guys, hi Kylie, N. Hi Zachary, or Zach, I'm not sure. Olga, good to see you too. Nigel, yes. Good to see you too. Angel. Hi Ben, Simon, Christina. Thanks again, everyone. Okay, well, it's pretty much 10, so I'm going to just slowly get us into our meeting for now. Thanks, everybody, again, for just waking up and hanging out and being in the meeting. Super Bowl Sunday, so hopefully some of you guys got to enjoy the game. I don't know if you're happy with the result or not. I feel that people are kind of like either they love or hate Tom Brady pretty much, but 7 Super Bowls is pretty impressive. So anyway, yeah, good to see you guys back. Here's a random kind of thing just on the side. For me this weekend, I was one of the judges in the National High School Ethics Bowl competition. So that was kind of an interesting thing. That my first time getting involved. I was hooked up with the judge thing by Professor Nancy Martin in religious studies here at Chapman. And so it was kind of interesting and fun. Like I just had to kind of evaluate the quality of argument and reasoning and persuasiveness of the different high school teams that I was judging. And there were all kinds of random and interesting topics like should the U.S. ban or regulate TikTok? Do they have an obligation to protect user data? Should students be given input into school decisions about contraceptive access or about COVID policies? K-pop stars, are they harmed by the aspects of the culture in which they're groomed to become K-pop stars? Like I've heard that they talked about plastic surgery that they all have a lot of times and social pressures and like exploitation. So is that like a bad practice? Factory farming was another topic. If someone was dating somebody and they had a criminal conviction and they spent time in prison before, do they have a moral obligation to say this on their early part of their dating relationships? So, a bunch of interesting topics. It was fun to be a judge. Anyway, so sometimes maybe some of you guys will get involved in the future if you find that as an interesting topic, ethics. Many Chapman students were moderators and stuff. So you have moderators, judges, the teams themselves, coaches. It was all done through Zoom. And it was kind of a fun little exercise in moral reasoning and philosophy. But back to our topic, okay, guys? Let me just say this. Many of you have already tapped into the chat, but if you haven't said hello or good morning or anything, just go ahead and put in a quick comment. I use it as a kind of informal attendance record, so make sure that you get recorded for that. If you're using a different screen name, then just make a mention of your roster name in the comment, and if needed for any purpose, I'll have a record. Okay, guys, so great. Let's go back to what we're talking about right now. This is our first subject in the semester, and it's philosophy of religion, and we've been working through the ontological argument and some of the different criticisms. So I'm going to just briefly repeat the main summary of the ontological argument, and then I'll try and bring us back up to speed with where we were, and we'll press on from there. So St. Anselm, about 1,000 years ago, wrote the ontological argument in his book, The Proslogion. And the basic argument is that the definition of God is greatest conceivable being. After this, it is claimed that this is a definition that everybody can agree on and has the same definition in mind. Theists and atheists alike understand the meaning of the word God as greatest conceivable being. So after this point is set down, the claim is that it is greater to exist in the mind and in reality than to only exist in the mind, because it's just more existence. It's being real instead of just being an idea in the head. So if it's greater to exist in both, and God is defined as the greatest conceivable being, he thinks logic tells us that he must exist in both, because if he didn't, then that would be a contradiction in terms. It would be saying the greatest conceivable being doesn't really exist and is therefore not as great as you could imagine. But that's getting our wires crossed. Saying the greatest being is not as great as you could possibly imagine sounds like a contradiction. So in order to live up to the definition, he has to exist in the mind and in reality, because that's greater. And he can't even be thought not to exist, according to the argument, because if he could, that would be a limitation or a flaw. And the greatest conceivable being wouldn't lack for anything. Okay, so after presenting the argument, then we looked at some objections. The first big objection came from the monk Ganilo. And Ganilo said that the problem with the argument is that you can generate arguments that run exactly parallel to that, but in those cases, we know the thing that is mentioned does not exist. He gives an example of the lost island. He says, suppose that the lost island is defined as the greatest conceivable island. Despite this, we know it isn't real. But if Anselm's logic is to be believed, it implies that the island must be real, because I guess it's greater to exist in reality and the mind than only the mind. But if we know this island is fake and just made up by us, then any argument which tries to establish that something is real in reality merely based on it having a definition or idea as being greatest conceivable is just a failed argument. So he thinks that the case made for the island stands and falls together with the case made by Anselm for God. If we are not convinced on the point about the island, then we would see the same kind of flaw in the case made for God, because in both examples, one says that from the idea of the greatest conceivable, the thing must really exist. If we demonstrate to the example of the island that that is not so, then he thinks this shows us the essential problem of Anselm's reasoning. Now, one more critic that we all spent some time on last Friday was G.E. Moore. So let's quickly brush up on that again. G.E. Moore said that existence is not a predicate. And that was his complaint against Anselm's argument, because in his view, Anselm treats existence as though it's a predicate, and it's not. What does this word predicate mean again? Who can tell me about that? Let's hear from you guys really, really fast on the point of what a predicate is. Predicate is, in other words, what type of thing? Good, it's an attribute, exactly, Cordy. It's an attribute or a feature of something. So if I told you that my shirt is blue, the shirt is the subject, the predicate is that it's got that color of blue. So his claim is that existence is not a predicate. It's not an attribute. And if it's not an attribute or feature of something, then it doesn't really make sense to say that if a being has all the best features, it must exist, because existence is a positive feature. No, says Rowe, this is wrong. It's not a feature. And so it's already confused and mistaken to claim that a perfect being must possess this so-called feature. All right, so now how does he show that it's not an attribute? Well, one way of putting it is just to think through it common sense-wise. Like, nobody describes anything as existing. That's just not normal. If I say to you, I had a pretty good, let's see, like my car. I tell you about my car. It's a BMW. It's a 4 Series. It's black. It's a coupe, but it has 4 doors. It exists. It's got about 45,000 miles on it. You know, one of those statements there is just kind of weird and awkward. Mentioning that it exists is not really saying anything that describes it, and it seems as though it's a misplaced way of presenting its features. So that's a common sense position, but he expands on this through a linguistic analysis. He says, we will show that existence is not a predicate by comparing sentences which do have a predicate with another set of sentences which replaces the predicate with the word exist. And by means of the substitution, we will see that the statements no longer carry any kind of sensible meaning. Take the statement, tigers growl. All tigers growl, most tigers growl, some tigers don't growl. No matter which of these different versions that we choose, they all make pretty clear sense. But when we take the word growl, replace it with exist, now the new statements, with the notable exception of some exist, none of those other statements make sense anymore. Consider some tigers don't growl. That's fine. It just means that there's at least one tiger that doesn't have that attribute. But if I say some tigers don't exist, now I'm speaking nonsense, because it's like saying there's something that's not something. And this is a contradiction in terms. If I say to you that, you know, most tigers are not white, like, because there's a very small number of white tigers. It's a rare breed. That's easy to understand because it means that there's a bunch of tigers, and if you counted them, there'd only be a tiny number of the ones that do exist that have this feature of being white, and most of them don't have that feature. But if I say most tigers exist, I can't categorize and divide those that have the so-called feature of existence from those that do not, because things that lack existence are not just existing beings lacking an attribute, they're nothing at all. So it breaks down into meaninglessness when we try to replace the predicate with the word exist. And this is his way of trying to present to the reader that it's not correct to say of existence that it's an attribute. If so, it doesn't function to assist Anselm's argument. Okay, so that brings us now to the next and last critic of the ontological arguments. We have just one more objection to him that we now want to kind of understand. So one more criticism of the Anselm ontological argument comes from this author, whose name is William Rowe. William Rowe, he's a little more close to the current day. He's an American philosopher who worked at Purdue University, and he retired in 2005 from Purdue. In 1993, he wrote a book which contains this essay that we're going to read. And so from 1993, his essay is called Why the Ontological Argument Fails. Why it fails. Okay, so you can see his title clearly states his position on the argument. He says that it fails. It doesn't succeed. It doesn't prove what it seeks to prove, namely that God really exists. So he thinks it's a failed argument, but we're going to hear his account as to why it fails as he thinks. So the big kind of picture behind his position in this argument is that you can't really prove something exists just by defining it as existing. So he thinks you can never establish that something really exists merely by suggesting the idea of it and the definition of it as an existing being. Defining something to exist, in other words, is not sufficient proof that it really exists in reality. Okay, so he says that the ontological argument and the followers of the argument essentially define God as existing and then claim that game over, it says in the definition that he exists, so you can't deny that he does. This is the definition of God that he thinks Anselm is operating with. God equals existing perfect being. So he says this is Anselm's given, definition of God, the existing perfect being. And he says it's kind of like once the definition is stated, he says that's the end of the argument. It says he exists in the definition. So if you deny that he exists, you're going against the definition itself. That's a contradiction. It's like saying the existing being doesn't exist. That is contradictory to the definition. But Rowe says you cannot prove something exists merely by putting the word existing in its definition. If you could prove things exist that way, then I could just make up words which mean existing whatever, and then say that is a sufficient proof that the thing is real. Now, we're going to now illustrate how this is an ineffective way to prove the existence of something. Okay. So Rowe wants us to now consider his example. The example he gives is to invent two different words, both of them having something to do with the idea of magicians. Okay, so these are two like stipulated make-believe words merely created for the purposes of carrying this argument forward. So imagine that we have this word magican. And on the other hand, magico. So the word magican, let's say, means existing magician. And by contrast, magico, as you could probably guess, if you didn't already know, means non-existing magician. Okay, magican, existing magician, magico, non-existing magician. So these two words are just words that refer to two categories of magicians, those that really exist, real people, versus those that don't exist and that are just make-believe characters and fictional make-believe people. So let's have this little diagram. And up here in this column, we're going to create the header magican. Up here to the right, on the opposite side of the divide, it's magico. Okay, now from you guys, let's see if we can just get a little discussion going. I'm just asking for a simple thing. What are some examples of people who you know who have been magicians in life, that was their profession? They perform magic tricks, they entertain people with illusions. There's certainly some notable names, but let's see what you could come up with, if any, on the side of magican, existing magicians, real life flesh and blood people who've chosen to do magic tricks for a career. Okay, Kylie, good one. Houdini is probably one of the most famous names in this field in the West. He actually died doing a trick, but anyway, different topic. Penn and Teller, yes, they kind of mix humor together with their magic stuff, but they do magic tricks, and so that's a good example too. Chris Angel, sure. I know he had a residency in Vegas for a while doing his tricks. We could add more names. Isn't there David Blaine? He does magic tricks on the street, plus he does a lot of escape artist type stuff. I know David Copperfield was from the 90s, and that was another well-known, yeah, Lauren, another well-known name. But anyway, the list goes on. This is just a short list, but I just wanted to give you guys a sense of the vibe of like what this refers to. These are just real magicians. Now over here, Magico. Help me with this side. This I'm asking you for names of people that are like mythical, fictional, make-believe, fantasy, people who do magic tricks and stuff, magical powers, but they're not even real people, characters and stuff. So you can think of some maybe. What are some of these names? Harry Potter. Okay, good, Nigel. Harry Potter, fictional character, not a real person. So he's a non-existing magician. Merlin, that's a good one, Cordy. Yes, the mythical Merlin from the old Knights of the Round Table, not a historical figure, just a made-up character. Mysterio, who is it? I'm kind of a little dull right now, but I'll take your word for it if you give me more details on the reference, but I'm sure it's fine. I think of like, I don't know, Gandalf and stuff from like Lord of the Rings. He's kind of a wizard, but I think that's close enough. Any other greatest hits, guys, on the Magico side of things? I guess it's not necessary to have a ton more, but I've only seen a few thrown out, but I guess it's fine. So, okay, fair enough. Look, so the point being that under the definition magican, there are some things that fit into that description, and under the definition magico, non-existing magician, there's some things that fit into that column. Now, here's where you need to take a little, to understand the next step of the argument, you have to engage in a little bit of thinking outside the box, a slight bit of mental gymnastics, but not too hard, I hope. Okay, so I want you to imagine a counterfactual timeline of our universe. Okay, so maybe that sounds hard, but anytime you watch a movie, you're already kind of doing that, right? You guys go and you see like a big comic book character movie, and it's like, oh, I know about the Marvel Comics universe. So you know, like in that universe, all the people and events and backstory. So I want you to imagine a different possible universe from ours, very similar to ours, with only this one minor difference. Okay, imagine a possible situation where there had never been magicians. So there was no Houdini, Penn and Teller, Chris Angel, David Blaine, just no such people. So this is just like our reality, except that field of profession is blank. No one's ever really done that in life, okay? So you imagining that case? Now imagine that within those circumstances, somebody makes this word Magican up, okay? So they say, hey, Magican, I'm making up this word and it means existing magician. So here's the question. If there were no magicians in reality, contrary to fact, but suppose that were so, if there were no magicians in reality and we still invented the word Magican, would magicians exist at that point or no? Would the establishment of the phrase Magican cause there to be magicians or not? See if you follow my question. So in a case where there's no magicians, but we made the word up anyway, would that bring them into reality? No, it wouldn't. Okay, very good, Angel. So whether the magicians exist or not has nothing to do with whether or not this word has been created. It just has to do with whether or not reality contains magicians or not. So even if we have the word magician, Magican, and it means existing magician, that is not proof that magicians have to exist. In case they didn't exist, say, here's another example. Today, all the magicians are assassinated or die spontaneously. So tomorrow, February the 9th, no more magicians exist. And then suppose I say, but hold on, let's think of the word Magican, which means existing magician. Would making the word bring back the existence of real-life magicians just on the basis of it having the definition that they exist? No. So what Roe is pointing out is that trying to prove that God exists just by defining him to exist is not really proof. Because suppose that in reality there is no God, just assume for the sake of discussion. If there is no God and the word means existing being that's perfect, then the word can still have that meaning, but there wouldn't be any real thing that it corresponds to, in fact. So the word Magican, he is kind of using as a stand-in for God. The similarity is that both are defined as existing in the definition. But what he's trying to show you is that with Magican, we can see that there don't need to be necessarily any such things in reality for the word to carry that meaning. And so it could be the same with the word God, defined as a being that exists, which is perfect, but in the absence of the world really having any such thing, it's just a word that has that meaning. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any real beings that match the definition given. Okay, let me read here, and you'll see him say the same thing in his own way. So Magican defined as existing magician. Magico defined as non-existing magician. Note that our friend has used existing as part of the definition of God. And so let me make up these two words. Now, what we have seen is that introducing existing or non-existing into the definition of a word has an important implication. If I introduce existing into the definition of the word, it follows that no non-existing thing could match the concept, but must some existing thing exemplify the concept Magican? No. From the fact that existing is included in the definition of Magican, it does not follow that some existing thing is a Magican. All that follows is that no non-existing thing could satisfy this definition. Now here's the key sentence. If there were no magicians in existence, so that little statement there, if there were no magicians in existence, that's him asking you to consider this counterfactual where there's no real magicians. If there were none, then there would be nothing to which the term Magican would apply. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from our definition of Magican that some existing thing is a Magican. Only if magicians exist will it be true that some existing thing is a Magican. And so now he says, I'm in a position to help my friend see from the mere fact that God is defined as existing, it does not follow that some existing thing is God. Whether some existing thing is God depends entirely on whether some existing being is wholly perfect. If no such thing exists, there will be nothing to which the concept or word refers. This being so, it clearly does not follow merely from the definition of God that some existing thing is God. only if a wholly perfect being does exist would it be true that God exists. Okay, so he believes the ontological argument is just kind of high-level, complex wordplay. A person says that the definition of God contains existence as one of its defining terms. And even if that is so, the definition of a word and existing according to the definition of that word is not the same thing as having been proven to really exist in reality. Now, his own chosen example of Magican, Magico, there's one thing that I admit is a little confusing about it, and that is the little mental gymnastics that I mentioned, where you have to kind of transport yourself to this thought of a situation where there were no magicians, and then you have to kind of think about, okay, if there weren't any, couldn't we still have this word mean magician that exists, and yet there wouldn't have been any? So you've got to do this like little bit of counterfactual reasoning, which is sometimes tricky. I've got a variation on his example that I think makes the point even more obvious. And so allow me, if I can, to just extend his thought process with a slight adjustment to his example. Okay? So now I'm asking you to think of these two words for a moment. Unican on the left and unico over here on the right. Now, parallel to these definitions given above, maybe you can guess what these two words refer to. Unican means what, you think? Based on the spelling and the lead into this example. Unican, I'm suggesting, is a word that means what? Unicorn, sure, but what kind though, Kylie? Pay attention to the spelling. It doesn't say unicorn, it says unican. So what do you think I mean by that? It's a unicorn which exists. Yes, correct. So it's a real life flesh and blood unicorn. What is a unico, on the other hand? Parallel to magico, so big hint. The unico would then be a what? Yes, so a non-existing unicorn, a make-believe fictional unicorn that doesn't really exist in life, in reality. Okay, now, for reasons that will become obvious if they're not already, we're going to not do anything with this. We're going to start over here on the right. So I know it's probably maybe not as familiar to all of us, like what are some names of some well-known or familiar fictional unicorns? Because unicorns as a thing in the media and in stories are perhaps a little rare. But there have been some examples. So I don't know, maybe someone in this class will know or can mention a non-existing unicorn out there in make-believe land. So any such example, if you have one. If you don't, I've got a few that I can put on the board. But let's see if anyone has something to supply the discussion with. I'm asking just for some names of some, you know, not existing unicorns. Too obscure? No, nothing? Let me see if you have something. I mean, because last hour some of the students had like 3 or 4 examples, guys. You don't have one? It's okay if you don't, but I'll help. Charlie, okay, good, Sydney, that's something. You know, so there's like internet meme a few years back. I don't know if it's still going or not, but Charlie was like this unicorn that speaks in these memes. So Charlie would be one. Yeah, from the YouTube videos. You say Lauren, My Little Pony might have had some. Yeah, there is I think one of the characters. I don't remember the name, but was it Twilight Sparkle or Rainbow Bright or something? Let's suppose that this is the name of the My Little Pony unicorn. Pegasus, it's close, Cordy, but I guess the Pegasus is the flying winged horse, and the unicorn is just with the one horn. So close, but not quite. There was this film that recently came out. I didn't watch it myself, but I read some of the commentary about it. Maybe somebody heard about this film, Jojo Rabbit. Very weird movie from what I know, but people said it was pretty good with Adolf Hitler like is the main character, and it's a comedy or something. I heard there's a unicorn that appears in this film. Maybe someone can confirm if any of you guys watched it, but whatever. That's another case. And I think I've heard of some of them appearing in a couple of other films too. But like anyway, you guys get the idea now. This is just a bunch of the, you know, make-believe unicorns from fantasy and fiction. What about unican? Is there any any individual who can be placed in this column? That's a clear question with a direct answer. Can we provide the name of a real unicorn? No, we can't. Yes, that's true. We cannot give the name of any such. And why not? Because they don't exist. Because there's no such reality. But hey, wait, look, the word unican means existing unicorn. So here again is another way of looking at William Rowe's criticism from another angle. Making the word unican up and saying that it carries the meaning existing unicorn has not changed anything about reality. Still, unicorns don't exist, even though I just now invented this word out of make-believe. So just because the word says existing unicorn, it would be foolish and wrong on its face to say to somebody, I just proved the existence of unicorns because I invented the word unican and it says by definition existing unicorn. So if you say they don't exist, it's like saying the existing unicorn doesn't exist. That can't be the case. So boom, unicorns are real. Obviously, that's not really a proof of anything. In our reality, there's no unicorns despite the invention of this word. So whether it's the word unican, magican, or even God, the author is pointing out that when you put existence as one of the defining features of something in the definition, that may be what the word means by definition, but it cannot by itself show that in reality something corresponds to this definition and actually is real. Okay, so I gave you the unican example, guys, because with unican, you don't have to think about a counterfactual where there's no such things as magicians, right? His magican example is exactly parallel to this with the one exception that in his case, we do have, like, as we know, Houdini, David Blaine, Penn and Teller. And so you kind of have to take that extra little step mentally of thinking about, well, what if they didn't exist, though? And if they didn't exist and we made up the word magican, then they still wouldn't exist. So I guess putting existence in the word doesn't change whether they're real or not. In the unican example, you don't have to think through a counterfactual where there's no unicorns because there actually are no unicorns. So it's, I think, a little bit more clear and precise to give it in this way, but it's the exact same point logically. So he says the implications of these considerations for Anselm's argument can now be traced. Anselm conceives of God as a being than which none greater is possible. He then claims that existence is a good feature, something that has it is greater than something that lacks it. If that is so, then no non-existing thing could satisfy his definition of God. If we suppose that some non-existing thing satisfies the concept, and also suppose that that non-existing thing might have existed in reality, then we are supposing that that non-existing thing might have been greater and is nevertheless a thing which is greater is not possible. Okay, so once again, it's not proof that God exists merely to have the definition of God contain existence as one of those key terms or defining principles. All right, guys, so that pretty much then closes the books on our discussions of the ontological argument and responses. So as a last kind of recap, the argument says that God is defined by all people as greatest conceivable being, and since it's greater to exist in reality than only the mind alone, he's got to exist in both. Gaunilo says no, because I can come up with ideas of other type of things that are also labeled greatest conceivable, say, for example, the Lost Island. But if Anselm's logic were correct, then that island would have to really exist, and we know it doesn't. So the argument given by Anselm is flawed in that way. Moore attacks the argument by saying existence is not an attribute or feature, and he thinks he can show that through the comparison of sentences with having an attribute and sentences which take a predicate, replace the attribute with the word exists, showing that the new statements generated by the replacement don't make clear sense. And then Rowe's point of objection was that defining something as existing fails as a proof that it really must exist. Consider the word magican, which he defines as an existing magician. Though there have been people who do magic tricks that are real, the word doesn't control whether those people existed or not. If they no longer existed or never did, the word could still have the meaning magican, could still have the meaning existing magician. And in the absence of any real such things, the word would just sit there without anything in reality that it corresponds to. Maybe in the case of God, he's defined as existing, but as with magican, the question is still a remaining open question. Is there any real thing that matches this definition or not? The definition doesn't give us the answer by itself. Okay, now then, we are going to move on to another big argument for God's existence. You know, and if anybody ever really found it interesting, you could pursue further studies in the ontological argument on your own time. I mean, there's also people who try to defend against those objections, that try to rebut the objections. I've heard clever response given by one person that Gaumilo's criticism of the Lost Island fails because when you think of the greatest conceivable anything, you're just thinking of God. And there's only one such concept. There's no greatest conceivable. There's just the greatest conceivable being, and it's God. And if you think the island is the greatest conceivable island, then you're just thinking of God again, and you're thinking of him as an island. And if that's the way you think of God, then actually the island does exist. It's just God in the form of an island. So I've heard people, try to come up with clever ways to resist the force of these objections. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on then to the next, which is what I consider to be an even better argument than Anselm's. So if I was, trying to make a persuasive case to somebody that God exists, I would probably favor this method than Anselm's method. So here it is. It's called the cosmological argument. Okay, the cosmological argument. This is another argument for God's existence, and it's an ancient argument. It goes back very, very far in time. You see written versions of this in the West that go back to the ancient Greeks thousands of years ago. You see written versions of it in other world religions and cultures that trace back even further, thousands of years behind the earliest written accounts in the West. So it's an ancient argument for God's existence, but it remains viable to this day. And the author, people have talked about it in every different generation, including up to the current day. So we have one American philosopher named Richard Taylor who presents this argument in our book. So here's his name, Richard Taylor. And Richard Taylor lived from 1919 until 2003. And he discusses the cosmological argument in a writing from 1963. So I'm just mentioning the one thing, that this is an argument that goes back way before he ever lived, but he discusses it in our book in the year 1963. So he just presents it and discusses it again to a modern audience. He's not the original source of the argument, which again traces back a long time. Okay, so anyway, this is his lifespan, the date that he wrote this discussion, the name of the argument, and a little bit about its older history. So let's get into the details of the cosmological argument. Okay, first thing I'd like to point out about the argument is the name of it and what the word cosmological means. Cosmological contains this root, cosmos, within it, and that's relevant to the idea of the argument. So let's kind of begin with this. Who in the chat has an idea about what the cosmos is? What's this word mean? What's the definition of the cosmos, if you were to take a stab at that? So let's kind of get on the same page with this word, cosmos. Okay, good, Cordy. Universe. That's very good. I like the way you put it, because sometimes the initial intuition of a student will be to say something like space. And that's okay, but space, I feel like sometimes people think that when you're sitting on the planet Earth, that's your home base, and you're looking out at space, and it's all the other parts of the universe. But we, ourselves, are part of space as well. We're sitting on the planet Earth, which is in the solar system, and it's floating in the big canopy of stars in the universe. So the cosmos, in other words, just refers to the totality of everything in the universe, all of space and time, not just one part of it, not just one planet or one solar system or even one galaxy, but the whole thing. Olga, you talk about a group of people. Well, like cosmopolitan would mean like the polity of all the people there. But all is still held as a link between the meaning of all matter and space and all people within a political body. So there's a kind of, there is a etymological linkage between the two. But I'm tracing its more common meaning as a reference to the canopy of all space and the expanse of all space and time. So anyway, cosmos, it is literally the entire universe, the whole thing. Okay, so the cosmological argument, therefore, is an argument about how could the universe exist? What's the cause, the reason, the explanation for the existence of the whole universe? That is a very big question. It's a question bigger than asking where a specific thing in the universe came from. Like, where did this planet come from? Or where did one person come from? Or where did like a mountain or a building or something come from? This is asking that question, but instead about all of it. Where did all of everything come from? And the argument basically tries to lead us to the conclusion that the only possible source that could have generated the whole universe must be a necessary being like a creator God. And other than that, there's no viable explanation. So goes the argument, but there are many steps that have to be filled in. I'm just kind of previewing for you the kind of big gist of the argument. Where the universe had to come from somewhere. Only thing that it could possibly come from that explains it is some kind of independent, necessary being like God. That's where we're leading, but let's try and get there through a series of steps. Okay. So as the discussion begins in the essay, the author utilizes a thought experiment, a hypothetical scenario, to get our minds focused on some key points in his discussion. So as I think I've mentioned last week, hypothetical scenarios, thought experiments are a common practice within philosophy. So just we'll be used to this kind of mental gymnastics throughout the semester. So I want you to imagine this setting and scene, okay? Put yourself in this position. Imagine that you're going on a walk, and you're going on a walk around in the woods. So it's like a nice hike through nature. You're walking out there, and you'd see whatever stuff people see in the woods when you go on a hike. You see trees, grass, dirt, rocks, maybe little scampering around creatures and stuff, streams, meadows. But suppose that on your nice nature walk, okay, you come across something quite unusual to see there in the woods. And what it is, well, here's a visual. This is you, first of all, walking in the woods. And then you come across this, it's a sphere, okay? It's a sphere, it's about your same height, and, light shines off of it, so there's my little artistic flair, adding this glint of light off the curved surface.